I'm glad you're here with me today. Stay until the end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I read every single one. The moment I walked through those courthouse doors, my son's attorney looked up from his papers and stopped mid-sentence. Just stopped. His pen hovered in the air. The color drained from his face so fast I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. My son was sitting right beside him, and I watched his smug expression falter for the first time in months. He leaned over and whispered something to the attorney, who shook his head slowly, like a man realizing the ground beneath him had just given way. They had spent weeks telling everyone who would listen that I was confused, fragile, that I didn't understand what I was signing or what I owned. They had called me a burden to my face and a liability behind my back. What they never once considered was that my husband had spent 32 years making sure that if this day ever came, I would not be standing there empty-handed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it really started, to a Tuesday evening in October, the kind that smells like wood smoke and dying leaves, when my son and his wife came to dinner and turned my world upside down. I had lived in our house in Cedarville, Ohio for 34 years. My husband Harold and I had bought it the year after our son Patrick was born, a wide cream-colored colonial with a wraparound porch and a backyard big enough for a vegetable garden. Harold built the raised beds himself one summer, cursing the August heat the whole time, and I had grown tomatoes, green beans, and zucchini in them every year since. Even after he passed, I kept the garden going. It felt like keeping a promise. I was 67 years old, living alone, and perfectly fine with that. I had my routines. Coffee at 6:30 in my yellow robe. The morning news with the volume turned up a little louder than it used to be. Phone calls with my friend Pauline on Wednesdays. Church on Sundays. I was not waiting to be rescued or managed or moved. I was simply living, which I had every right to do. Patrick called to say he and his wife Brielle would be coming by for dinner that Tuesday. I made pot roast the way he liked it, with those small golden potatoes and a loaf of sourdough from the bakery on Elm. I set the table with the good placemats. I was glad he was coming. We didn't see each other as often as I would have liked, and when we did, Brielle had a way of making the air feel thinner, but I always told myself that was my imagination. It was not my imagination. They arrived 20 minutes late without mentioning it. Patrick kissed my cheek. Brielle walked past me into the living room and started looking around, the way a person looks at a hotel room. They're trying to decide if it's worth the money. Patrick sat down at the table while I brought the food over, and before I had even taken my own seat, Brielle said, "We need to have a serious conversation, Gloria." Not Mom, Gloria. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap the way I had learned to do when I needed to think before I spoke. "Of course," I said. "What's on your mind?" Patrick glanced at his wife. That single glance told me everything about where the power sat in that marriage. "This house is too much for you," Brielle said. "The upkeep alone, the roof, the furnace, Patrick and I have been talking, and we think it makes more sense for you to move somewhere more manageable. There's a very nice senior living community out in Westfield. We already called and got you on the wait list." I looked at my son, Patrick. He picked up his fork. "Mom, she's right. You fell last spring. I tripped on the garden hose. I caught myself." "You were alone. What if it had been worse?" I had heard this argument before from well-meaning people, but the way he said it, flat, like he had rehearsed it, told me this was not concern. This was a plan that had already been made. "And the house?" I asked. "What happens to the house?" Brielle smoothed her napkin across her lap. "We take it over. Patrick grew up here. It stays in the family." There it was. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I said, "I appreciate you sharing your thoughts." And I served the pot roast, and we ate dinner in a silence so brittle I was afraid to breathe too hard. When they left, Patrick hugged me at the door, and I noticed he held on a half-second longer than usual, like a person who knows they've done something they can't take back. I stood on the porch until their taillights disappeared around the corner. Then I went inside and sat in Harold's old chair by the window, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. My son had not come for dinner. He had come to begin the process of erasing me. 2 weeks later, without a single conversation in between, a man in a gray parka appeared at my door saying he was a property assessor and that Patrick had authorized an evaluation of the home. I told him calmly that my son did not own this home and could not authorize anything, and I closed the door. That same afternoon, I received a letter, typed on actual letterhead, from a law firm I had never heard of, stating that in the interest of protecting my well-being, Patrick was exploring guardianship options. The letter used words like cognitive assessment and daily living challenges and best interests of the family. I read it 3 times. My hands were steady, but something cold had settled in my chest, something I recognized as the particular fear that comes not from a stranger's cruelty, but from your own child's. I called Pauline. "Get a lawyer," she said, before I had finished explaining. "Today, Gloria. Not tomorrow. Today." Pauline had been through her own version of this 11 years ago when her brothers tried to push her out of her late mother's estate. She knew the shape of it before I did. I called an attorney named Sandra Chu, who had been recommended to me by a woman at my church, whose daughter used her in a property dispute. Sandra met with me 2 days later, a small, sharp-eyed woman in her early 50s who did not waste words or sympathy on things that did not require them. I brought everything I had: the deed, Harold's will, our bank statements, the letter from Patrick's law firm. Sandra read through it all with the focused quiet of someone who had seen worse and won anyway. "Before we talk about what they're trying to do," she said, setting the letter down, "I need to ask you something. Do you know the full extent of what your husband left?" I thought I did. The house, a modest savings account, Harold's pension that paid out a small monthly sum. We had not been wealthy people. Harold had worked for 30 years as a civil engineer for the county. I had worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company until I retired at 62. We had lived carefully and without excess, and I had assumed that meant simply, "There's a financial advisory firm here in Cedarville," Sandra said, turning her notepad toward me. "Hartwell Asset Management. Your husband's name appears in their client records. Have you ever heard of them?" I had not. "He was a client for 19 years, Sandra said. "The account is in both your names." The drive to Hartwell Asset Management took 11 minutes. I know because I counted every traffic light, trying to keep my mind from running too far ahead of me. The advisor who met with me was a man named Theodore Marsh, silver-haired and deliberate, in the way of someone who understood that the information he carried changed people's lives. He shook my hand and asked if I wanted coffee, and when I said yes, he got it himself rather than calling anyone else. I noticed that. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, settling across from me at a table that was not a desk. He had chosen a round table, I realized, so neither of us would be sitting at a disadvantage. "Your husband first came to us when your son was 7 years old. He said he wanted to make sure that if anything ever happened to him before he expected it to, you would never have to depend on anyone else's generosity." I sat very still. "Harold was a methodical man," Theodore continued. "He didn't take risks. He put money in slowly, consistently, over nearly 2 decades into a combination of index funds, municipal bonds, and 2 real estate investment trusts. He never touched the principal. He reinvested the dividends every quarter." He turned his computer screen toward me. The number I saw did not process immediately. My brain simply refused to accept it as something that belonged to my life. "That can't be right," I said. "It is," Theodore said quietly. "There's also a property holding I think you should know about. Are you familiar with the Millbrook Professional Center on Route 9? I was. It was a small strip of professional offices, a dentist, an accountant, a physical therapist. Harold and I had driven past it hundreds of times. Harold purchased a partial interest in that property in 2003, Theodore said. He later bought out the other investor. He owned it outright at the time of his death, which means you own it now. The tenants pay rent every month." I thought about my son, about his law firm and his authorized assessor and his guardianship filing. "Theodore," I said, "does my son know about any of this?" He shook his head. "Harold was very specific that the account information was not to be shared with anyone without your direct authorization. We've been waiting for you to come to us." On the drive home, I pulled into the parking lot of a pharmacy and sat there for 20 minutes. Not crying exactly. Something else. The feeling of realizing that the person you shared a life with had loved you so quietly and so completely that you were only now, years after he was gone, discovering the full shape of it. I thought about Harold building those garden beds in the August heat, complaining about the sun, wiping his face with an old handkerchief, and quietly, without telling me, building something else entirely, a wall between me and whatever hardness might come. I went home and called Sandra Chu. Cancel any further contact from Patrick's attorneys, I said, and I need you to file a response to that guardianship inquiry. I have some things I'd like to show them. Patrick showed up 3 days later without calling, which he had started doing recently, as though I had already lost the right to my own schedule. He had a folder under his arm. He looked tired. Brielle was not with him, which surprised me, and for a moment I thought maybe he had come to apologize. He hadn't. "Mom, I need you to look at these," he said, spreading papers on the kitchen table. "It's the intake paperwork for Westfield Gardens. If we get it done now, you keep your spot. If we wait, Patrick," I said, "sit down." He sat, mostly out of habit, I think. "I've spoken with an attorney," I said, "and with Hartwell Asset Management." The name landed like a stone in still water. I watched the ripples cross his face. "What's Hartwell?" he said, but his voice had changed. Just slightly. "Your father's financial advisors," I said. "For the last 19 years. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know Dad had financial advisors." "No," I said. "He didn't tell you." "He told me." That was not entirely accurate. Harold had not told me either, but I needed Patrick to understand that what was his father's was mine, and what was mine was not available for his plans. "I'm not moving to Westfield Gardens," I said. "I'm not signing anything. I'm not going through a cognitive assessment to prove something to you that isn't true. And if you continue to pursue guardianship without legal basis, Sandra Chua will respond in kind." Patrick stared at me. He had his father's eyes, gray-green and hard to read. "Brielle thinks I know what Brielle thinks," I said. "But Brielle is not my family. You are. And I'm asking you right now to decide whose side of this you're actually on." He left without the folder. Things got worse before they got better. 2 weeks later, Sandra called to tell me that Patrick and Brielle had escalated. They had retained a new attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who apparently specialized in contested estates and had a reputation for being difficult. Foss sent a formal request for a full accounting of my assets, implying that Harold's estate had been improperly distributed and that I might have received assets that rightfully should have passed differently. "It was a legal fishing expedition," Sandra explained. "They were hoping to find something to use." "Let them fish," she said. "There's nothing to find. Harold's estate was administered correctly. Everything is documented." I trusted her, but I would be lying if I said the letters stopped affecting me. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being forced to defend yourself against the people who are supposed to love you. Every piece of mail from Foss felt like a small violence. My neighbor Frances noticed before I had to say anything. She appeared at my back door one Saturday morning with a jar of her pickled banana peppers and a look on her face that meant she was not going to pretend everything was fine. "You're losing weight," she said. "I'm fine. You're not sleeping, Frances?" "Patrick came by yesterday when you weren't home," she said. "He was walking around the outside of the house, looking at the windows. I watched him from mine." I set the jar of peppers on the counter and sat down. "He was looking at the gutters," Frances said carefully, "and the roof line, like he was pricing repairs." I understood what that meant. "Can I tell you something honestly?" Frances said. She was 71, had buried a husband, raised 3 children on her own for 10 years before she remarried. She knew things. "What Patrick is doing, it has a name. And you are not the first woman I've watched go through it, but you might be the first one I've seen go through it with a lawyer and a financial advisor already in place. That matters." She was right. It mattered enormously. The court deed arrived on a Wednesday in February. Sandra had filed a countermotion to dismiss the guardianship petition, supported by documentation from my physician, 2 character letters from people in my church community, and the full accounting from Hartwell. Patrick's attorney, Gerald Foss, had requested the hearing, apparently confident he had grounds. He did not have grounds, but he had a client who believed he did, which is sometimes more dangerous. I wore the charcoal blazer I had bought for Harold's retirement dinner 17 years ago. It still fit. I thought about that while I was getting dressed, how some things hold their shape when you take care of them. Sandra met me outside the courtroom. "Ready?" "Yes," I said. We went in. Foss was already seated with Patrick. Brielle was there too, sitting just behind them, wearing a concerned expression that would have read as genuine to anyone who didn't know what it was covering. Patrick looked at me when I walked in. I looked back. I did not look away. The judge was a woman named Honorable Claire Bateson, who had been on the family court bench in our county for 14 years. Sandra had mentioned her without editorializing, which I took as a good sign. Judges who earn respect don't usually do it by being soft. What happened next was not something I had expected. As Sandra and I settled at our table and Foss began arranging his materials, Judge Bateson looked up from her file. She looked at me, and something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone else in that room seemed to notice, but I noticed it because I was watching her the way you watch someone when your entire life is sitting on what they decide. She looked at me as though she recognized me, and then, after a moment, she composed herself and called the hearing to order. I did not understand what I had seen. I filed it away. The hearing proceeded. Foss argued that I was an elderly woman living alone whose husband's estate had been improperly managed, that there were concerns about my daily functioning, and that a guardian, Patrick, would ensure my safety and proper care of my assets. He was polished. He used words like protective oversight and family continuity and vulnerability. Sandra countered with documents. Medical records showing no cognitive impairment, financial records showing careful legal management of everything Harold had built. A statement from Theodore Marsh at Hartwell confirming that Harold's investment plan had been conducted with full legal transparency over 19 years. Then she said something I had not known she was going to say. Your Honor, we'd also like to note that the property at 4418 Millbrook Professional Center, Route 9, which my client owns outright, currently generates rental income from 5 tenants, one of whom is the dental practice of Brielle Whitfield's brother, who has been renting at the same address for 6 years. The Whitfield family has been the landlord of his practice this entire time without his knowledge, or it appears, the knowledge of the petitioner. The courtroom was very quiet. Foss looked at Patrick. Patrick looked at Brielle. Brielle's careful expression broke, just for a moment, into something raw and unplanned. That was when Judge Bateson spoke. Counsel, I'd like a brief recess. During the recess, Sandra led me to a small room off the corridor. How are you doing? Better than I expected, I said, which was true. When we returned to the courtroom, Judge Bateson asked that both attorneys approach the bench. I watched the conversation from my seat. Foss's posture changed, that particular change of a man realizing he has miscalculated. When they returned to their tables, he would not look at Patrick. Judge Bateson returned to the full courtroom and spoke. This court finds no legal basis for the guardianship petition as filed. The petitioner has provided no medical evidence of incapacitation, no documentation of financial mismanagement, and no credible demonstration that Mrs. Management Whitfield is unable to manage her own affairs. The petition is dismissed. She paused. I also want to note for the record that this court takes seriously any attempt to use guardianship proceedings as a mechanism for asset acquisition. Should further action be taken along these lines without substantive new evidence, this court will consider appropriate sanctions. She looked at Foss, then, briefly, at Patrick. Then she looked at me. After the hearing, as people moved around us, Sandra was gathering her files and I was putting on my coat, and Judge Bateson appeared in the doorway of the courtroom, not in her robe anymore, just a woman in a dark suit. Mrs. Whitfield, she said, do you have a moment? Sandra and I followed her to a small conference room. The judge closed the door and turned toward me. I apologize if I seemed distracted at the start of the hearing, she said. Seeing you, I wasn't certain at first, but I am now. About 30 years ago, you were a bookkeeper at Helton Manufacturing? I was. I had worked there for over a decade. I was 24, she said. First year out of law school. I'd just started with the county attorney's office, and I was handling a records request at Helton. I was completely out of my depth. It was my first real independent assignment, and I made a mistake in the filing that was going to take down an entire case timeline. A woman in the accounting office. You stayed 2 hours after closing to help me reconstruct the documents correctly. You never told my supervisor. You never made me feel like an idiot. You just helped. I remember the records request. I did not remember her face. I'd stayed late to help an anxious young woman in a navy blazer, and then I went home and made dinner and did not think about it again. That case led to my first commendation, she said. I've thought about that afternoon more than you would probably believe. She did not say that it had affected her ruling. She did not need to. The ruling had been correct. Sandra had built an airtight case. But I understood now why she had looked at me the way she did. Why the room had steadied. I thanked her. She shook my hand firmly and left. Outside on the courthouse steps, the February air was cold and sharp. Sandra was walking beside me, and she said quietly, "That was something." "Yes," I said. "You really had no idea?" "No," I said. "You really had no idea?" "No," I said. "I just stayed late one evening. It didn't seem like much at the time. Patrick called me 4 days after the hearing. Brielle was not on the call. I could tell by the quality of the silence that he was alone. "Mom," he said, "I don't know how to start this." "Start wherever you need to," I said. He was quiet for a long time. Then, "Brielle was pushing this more than I let on. She's been, I don't know. She fixates on things. The money, the house. I went along with more than I should have." "Patrick." "I know. Why didn't you just talk to me?" Another silence. "Because she made it sound so reasonable. She said you were struggling, that you needed help, that if we didn't act, someone else might take advantage of you." And I wanted to believe her. It was easier than admitting that I had married someone who was keeping score on my family. I had raised this man. I had read to him every night until he was old enough to be embarrassed by it. I had driven him to swim practice at 5:30 in the morning for 6 years. I had sat in a hospital waiting room for 9 hours when he had his appendix out at 31, flown in from a conference I had no business missing. And I had also watched him, slowly, over the course of a decade of marriage, become someone I recognized less and less. "I'm not going to pretend none of this happened," I said. "I know. I'm also not going to hold it against you forever," I said. "But some things need to change. Brielle needs to understand that I'm not a problem to be managed. And you need to decide for yourself, not for me, whether that marriage is built on something real." He said he understood. I don't know yet whether he did. What I know is that Brielle filed for divorce 8 months later. Patrick told me by phone, and his voice had a particular quality, not relief exactly, but the sound of a man who had put down something very heavy and was still figuring out where his hands were supposed to go. He came to Cedarville for Christmas that year. Just him. He stayed for 4 days. We didn't talk much about any of it. We watched old movies, and I made his grandmother's apple cake, and we went for a walk along the river one afternoon, and he said, "I miss Dad," and I said, "Me too," and we walked the rest of the way in silence that didn't need to be filled. It's been 2 years since the hearing. I still have my morning coffee in the yellow robe. The garden beds Harold built are going strong. I added a row of lavender last spring along the south fence, something I'd always wanted to try. I volunteer 2 mornings a week at a nonprofit called Homeground, which provides legal navigation services to older adults facing housing disputes. Sandra Chu connected me with the director. I answer phones, help with filing, make coffee. Sometimes I sit with women who have just received a letter from an attorney, and I say to them what Pauline once said to me: "Get a lawyer. Today, not tomorrow." The Millbrook Professional Center still stands on Route 9. Theodore Marsh at Hartwell sends me a quarterly report. I read it carefully now. Harold would have wanted me to understand what I own. I have learned something in the past 2 years that I wish I had understood sooner. There is a difference between being cared for and being managed. One comes from love. The other comes from fear. Usually someone else's fear of you, of your independence, of the fact that you exist on your own terms, and that makes their plans harder. Harold knew the difference. He spent 32 years making sure I would never have to surrender one for the other. I used to wonder why he didn't just tell me about Hartwell, about the property, about all of it. I think I understand now. He knew me. He knew I would have said we didn't need it, that we should give more away, that the garden was enough. He kept it quiet because he knew that someday I would need to walk into a room and surprise someone, and he wanted me to have that. He gave me the ability to stand my ground. I just had to find the ground. If you're watching this and something in it sounds familiar, if you've had someone tell you that your independence is a liability, that your age means you've lost the right to your own decisions, I want you to hear this clearly: you have not. Your life is still yours. The people who love you will prove it by asking what you want, not by deciding for you. And if they won't ask, find someone who will help you make them listen. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've been through something like this, leave a comment. I read them. What would you have done in my place? I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in an abstract way, in a very specific, practical way. Patrick didn't wake up one morning and decide to betray me. It built slowly, one small surrender at a time, one afternoon where he let Brielle speak for him instead of forming his own thought, one phone call he didn't make, one conversation he avoided because it was easier to go along. That's how these things grow. Not in a single moment of cruelty, but in 100 quiet failures of courage. And I think about my own side of that equation too, because I wasn't entirely without fault. I had watched my son change over the years of that marriage and told myself it wasn't my place to say anything. I kept the peace when I should have told him the truth. We both paid for that. What I know now is that integrity doesn't hold itself. You have to tend to it the way Harold tended to those investment accounts, quietly, consistently, without fanfare, putting something in every single time even when no one is watching, and the return seems too far away to matter. Harold never told me about Hartwell because he was not the kind of man who needed credit for doing the right thing. He just did it. 32 years of doing it. And when the moment came, all of that quiet work showed up in a courtroom and changed everything. I think about Sandra, who built our case document by document without drama, and Theodore, who had kept Harold's confidence for 19 years without a single lapse. These were people whose word meant something because they had spent years making it mean something. You build that kind of trust the same way you build anything worth having, slowly, through actions, not declarations. And I think about Judge Bateson, who looked up from that bench and recognized me from one evening 30 years ago, when I stayed late and helped a young woman who was scared and overwhelmed. I did not stay late that evening because I expected anything from it. I stayed because it was the right thing to do and I was in a position to do it. That is all. Cause and effect doesn't always move in straight lines or on any schedule you can predict. Sometimes what you put out into the world takes 30 years to find its way back to you. The only thing you can control is whether what you put out was worth sending. The hardest part of this whole experience was not the legal letters or the court date or even the moment I realized my son had authorized a stranger to walk through my home and price the repairs. The hardest part was deciding what kind of person I wanted to be in response to it. Bitter would have been easy. Cutting Patrick off entirely would have been understandable. But I had watched Harold move through difficult people and difficult situations, his whole life with the steadiness that I used to mistake for indifference. It wasn't indifference, it was the choice, made over and over, to respond from your values rather than from your wound. I'm still practicing that. Some days I'm better at it than others. What I want to leave you with is this. Your history is not behind you. It is underneath you. Every choice you made with integrity, every time you helped someone who couldn't pay you back, every year you lived honestly and worked carefully. That is the ground you are standing on right now. You may not be able to see it, but it is there. And when the moment comes that you need it, you will find it holds.